September 1396. The banks of the Danube shimmer beneath the late summer sun, but what gathers there is no peaceful sight. Across the rolling plains near the town of Nicopolis, banners of every color whip in the wind, fleur-de-lis of France, the double cross of Hungary, the lions of England, the crosses of the Teutonic Knights. Thousands of European knights, nobles, and men-at-arms clad in gleaming steel stand ready for what they believe will be a final glorious crusade. They are young, proud, and certain of victory. Facing them lies the Ottoman Empire led by Sultan Bayezid, known to friend and foe alike as the Thunderbolt. His army is not a rabble of raiders. It is a disciplined war machine, hardened Sipahi cavalry, battle-hungry janissaries, Tatar auxiliaries, and veterans drawn from every corner of his domains. For decades, the Ottomans have been expanding relentlessly across the Balkans, their shadow creeping ever closer to the heart of Europe. And now at Nicopolis, the fate of Christendom seems to hang in the balance. The European crusaders had come with fire in their hearts. They came not only for God, but for glory, for wealth, and for renown. French nobles bragged openly of who would capture the most banners, who would take the most prisoners. Their armor sparkled in the sun. Their retinues paraded in silks and colors, as if preparing for a tournament rather than a war. They believed the Ottomans would scatter at the first charge, crushed beneath the iron tide of chivalry. But beneath their confidence lurked danger. The Crusaders were divided by language, pride, and ambition. Hungarians distrusted the French mocked the Germans, and the Germans resented the Italians. Each lord sought to lead, none wished to follow. And while they quarreled, Sultan Bayezid prepared with cold efficiency. His army did not shine with vanity. It crouched in patience, dug in, waiting to spring the trap. On the morning of September 25th, the Crusaders gazed down at the Ottoman lines stretched across the plain. Banners fluttered, trumpets blared. The knights spurred their war horses forward, lances couched, certain that destiny rode with them. What they did not know was that within hours, their shining host would be shattered. Their pride humbled their comrades, slaughtered or enslaved. For at Nicopolis, the dream of a new crusade would die in blood and fire. To understand the clash at Nicopolis, one must step back into the late 14th century, when the Ottoman Empire surged like a storm across the Balkans. Founded little more than a century earlier, the Ottomans had transformed from a frontier principality into a power that terrified Christendom. Under Sultan Murad I and his son Bayezid I, their armies had swept through Thrace, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Albania. Their victories were not isolated raids, but a systematic conquest. Each year, Christian kingdoms lost cities, fortresses, and fields to the relentless Crescent banner. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, the Serbs suffered a devastating blow, leaving much of the Balkans open to Ottoman domination. By the mid-1390s, only a few strongholds remained outside their control, and Hungary under King Sigismund stood as the last great bulwark of Christendom in the east. Sigismund, young yet ambitious, understood that if the Ottomans broke through the Danube frontier, the heart of Europe itself would lie exposed. He raised the alarm, calling for a crusade to halt Bayezid's advance. The call was heard. Pope Boniface IX blessed the campaign as a holy war, framing it as the chance to deliver Christendom from the Turkish menace. France, still locked in the 100 Years' War, found an opportunity for its restless knights to earn honor abroad. Burgundy, proud and wealthy, sent a glittering host under the command of John the Fearless heir to the duchy. German princes, Venetian galleys, Wallachian contingents, and even English knights joined the cause. It was a patchwork of powers, united more by the lure of glory and plunder than by true unity of command. The Crusaders saw themselves as heirs to the traditions of the great Crusades of Jerusalem. Their songs boasted of victory before the battle had even begun. Chroniclers describe their march like a procession of arrogant knights, glittering in polished armor banners, rich with color, their confidence soaring. But beneath the spectacle lay deep divisions. The French nobles, proud of their lineage, scorned Sigismund's Hungarian veterans, dismissing them as mere border fighters. The Germans distrusted the Venetians. Each nation followed its own leader, and the coalition lacked a single, unquestioned commander. Meanwhile, Sultan Bayezid, known as Yildirim the Thunderbolt, was consolidating his grip on the Balkans. A ruthless tactician, he had crushed the remnants of the Bulgarian kingdom and forced Serbia into vassalage. He commanded not only his disciplined janissaries, but also swift Sipahi cavalry and auxiliary forces from Tatars and Balkan allies. Unlike the Crusaders, his army was hardened, united, and accustomed to victory. Thus, the stage was set. On one side, a brilliant yet brutal sultan whose empire surged with momentum. On the other, a crusading coalition resplendent in armor but fractured by pride. The Crusaders marched east, believing they would drive the Ottomans back in a single stroke. Few realized they were walking straight into a storm from which few would return. By the summer of 1396, the crusading host had assembled in Hungary. To contemporaries, it looked less like an army than a festival of Europe's nobility. French knights gleamed in polished steel, their banners bright with fleurs-de-lis. Burgundians wore embroidered surcoats, Germans marched in disciplined blocks, and English volunteers carried the scars of the 100 Years' War. Together with Hungarian veterans, they formed a host that stretched for miles along the Danube, from Buda King. Sigismund led them south. Venetian galleys shadowed their march on the river, carrying provisions and siege engines. To peasants in the Balkans, the sight was awe-inspiring. Thousands of soldiers, their songs and trumpets echoing across the plains. Many crusaders boasted openly that Bayezid's Turks would be crushed in a single charge, but pride ran deeper than discipline. Sigismund urged caution, warning his allies of the Ottoman speed and cunning. The Hungarians counseled to guard supply lines, but French and Burgundians mocked such restraint as cowardice. They craved swift battle, eager to seize glory before others could. Their advance grew harsher as they entered Ottoman-held lands. Towns suspected of aiding the enemy were pillaged, villages burned. At Vajdin, Bulgarian defenders were massacred after surrender. Even allies like Wallachian Prince Mircea protested, fearing such cruelty would turn the local population against them. Few listened. Meanwhile, Sultan Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt, was already in motion. He called forth his vassals, Serbian cavalry under Stefan Lazarevich, swift Tatar riders, Anatolian infantry, and his disciplined janissaries. His march lacked splendor, but not purpose. Where crusaders slowed by pomp, the Ottomans advanced with precision, digging trenches, driving stakes, and preparing killing grounds. By September, both hosts neared Nicopolis, a fortress rising over the Danube. The Crusaders camped in splendor, their tents glowing red and white in the sun nights, jousting in mock tournaments as if victory was already won. Across the valley, Bayezid's army assembled in silence, patient and relentless. The Crusaders marched, believing they sought glory, yet unknowingly, they were riding straight into the trap that would end the age of chivalry. By mid-September 1396, the crusading host reached Nicopolis, a fortress perched on a bluff above the Danube. Its thick stone walls overlooked the river like a guardian of the frontier, but within the Ottoman garrison braced for a siege. To the Crusaders, this was confirmation of their glory. They unfurled their banners across the valley, erected gleaming tents in bright colors, and prepared to storm the fortress. The Hungarians advised patience, arguing that starvation would force the defenders to surrender. But the French nobles, hungry for immediate renown, mocked the idea of waiting. "This is no war for peasants," they sneered, "but for knights." And so the Crusaders launched bold assaults against the walls. Scaling ladders and siege towers were raised, but the defenders rained down arrows, stones, and boiling pitch. Each charge was repelled. The Crusaders laughed it off as sport, convinced victory was only a matter of time. At night, their camp resounded with revelry. Music and feasting echoed beneath the stars, wine flowing as knights boasted of the titles and ransoms they would claim. John of Nevers, the Burgundian heir, declared he would carve his name into history beside the conquerors of old. But beneath the noise, tension simmered. Sigismund and his Hungarian veterans grew alarmed at the arrogance of their allies, sensing the trap that might lie ahead. Inside the fortress, the Ottoman defenders held firm their spirits, buoyed by news that Bayezid was marching with overwhelming force. They needed only to endure. The Sultan's army was already close, advancing, swiftly unseen by the jubilant crusaders. Then came word Bayezid himself was approaching, his army numbering tens of thousands. Instead of panic, the news was met with cheers in the crusader camp. Here was the chance they had dreamed of, not a slow siege, but a decisive battle in the open field. The French knights in particular exulted, eager to meet the Ottomans in a glorious charge. They pictured themselves riding down the Turkish rabble, scattering them like chaff before the wind. Yet in truth, the Ottomans had prepared the ground with care. Stakes had been driven to blunt cavalry charges. Trenches were dug to slow the advance. Behind them, rows of archers and disciplined janissaries waited. And beyond, Bayezid's Sipahi cavalry and Serbian allies stood ready to crush whatever remained. The Crusaders celebrated their destiny. The Ottomans sharpened theirs. The clash at Nicopolis was no longer a question of if, but when. Dawn broke on the 25th of September, 1396. The valley before Nicopolis fortress lay bathed in a golden light. Yet beneath that beauty lurked a fatal illusion. The Crusader host, restless after weeks of marching and boasting, now pressed for battle. In the grand pavilion, arguments raged. King Sigismund of Hungary, cautious and deliberate, urged patience. Let the Wallachians and other light troops test the ground. Let the heavy cavalry wait. But his words fell on deaf ears. The French and Burgundian nobles, clad in glittering armor and hungry for glory, scoffed at caution. "Are we not the flower of Christendom?" they jeered. John of Nevers, barely 24, declared that delaying would stain their honor. Around him, young knights beat their gauntlets on the table in agreement, while seasoned Hungarian lords exchanged dark glances. Pride had become louder than reason. Beyond the tent walls, the Crusader camp swelled with feverish anticipation. Trumpets split the morning sky, heralding the advance. Crusader banners unfurled in the wind, the lilies of France, the crosses of Burgundy, the black eagles of Germany. Horses stamped and neighed, armored knights lowered visors, eager to charge. Priests raised crucifixes, blessing men who shouted Deus Vult. The air itself seemed to tremble, thick with dust, sweat, and reckless confidence. Across the valley, the Ottomans stood silent. Sultan Bayezid had arranged his defenses with cold precision. Stakes had been driven deep into the ground, forming jagged barriers against cavalry. Behind them, ranks of archers waited with taut bows. The janissaries stood in perfect discipline, unmoving, while further back, the Sipahi cavalry remained hidden, ready to unleash a devastating counterstrike. It was not a defensive stumble, but a snare deliberately laid. Sigismund, watching the vanguard prepare, tried once more to restrain them. "You dash headlong into ruin," he cried, but his voice was drowned by the thunder of hooves. The French and Burgundian knights, proud and unyielding, spurred their steeds forward. Banners streamed like fire in the wind, lances gleamed in the rising sun. Dust rose in great clouds as the flower of Europe thundered across the plain, their confidence blinding them to the danger ahead. The trap was about to be sprung. The charge of the French and Burgundian knights shook the earth. Thousands of hooves pounded the soil, a thunderous wave of steel and flesh crashing toward the Ottoman line. For a brief moment, it seemed unstoppable. The crusaders roared their war cries. Lances leveled banners streaming like flames in the wind. Dust engulfed the valley as the flower of Europe hurled itself into the trap. Then the first shock came. The front ranks slammed into sharpened stakes hidden in the ground. Horses screamed as they were impaled or stumbled violently, riders catapulted into chaos. Knights tried to leap over the barricades, but the dense lines of wooden spikes broke the momentum of the charge. Confusion spread like wildfire. Before the crusaders could recover, the sky darkened. Ottoman archers released their volleys. A storm of arrows rained down, hammering armor, piercing horses, striking through gaps in plate. Men fell screaming, trampled by their own comrades. Still, the knights pressed forward, hacking through stakes with axes dragging them aside in desperate fury. Inch by inch, the vanguard clawed through the obstacles. The French knights, with sheer determination, managed to breach the defenses. They crashed into the first Ottoman lines, scattering archers and cutting down light troops. For a fleeting moment, victory seemed within grasp. Steel clashed shields splintered the crusaders' might, carving a bloody wedge into Bayezid's ranks. Trumpets blared from the crusader camp as cheers erupted. The nobles believed triumph was at hand, but Bayezid had planned for this. Behind the archers stood the janissaries, disciplined and unyielding. As the knights pushed forward, they met a wall of spears and halberds. Horses reared, knights were pulled down and finished on the ground. The clash was brutal, close, and merciless. The narrow breach turned into a killing ground, the weight of the crusaders trapped in a funnel of death. And still, the trap was not fully closed. Hidden on the flanks, Bayezid's Sipahi cavalry waited for the signal. The Sultan's hand rose calm and deliberate, then dropped. With a roar, the Sipahis surged out from the dust, sweeping around the crusaders' exposed sides. The battlefield that had once echoed with cries of triumph now thundered with despair. The Valley of Nicopolis had become a cauldron of death. The once proud charge of the Crusader knights was now a desperate struggle in a trap that tightened with every passing moment. Horses lay writhing among broken stakes, their riders dragged down and slaughtered. The air was thick with dust blood and the screams of men who realized too late that pride had led them to ruin. At the center of the maelstrom, the French and Burgundian vanguard fought with ferocity born of despair. John of Nevers, his golden surcoat torn and stained with blood, still swung his sword with reckless valor, rallying the few who remained near him. Around him, nobles who had once feasted and boasted now fought like cornered beasts, slashing at janissaries and sipahi as the ring of steel closed tighter. King Sigismund, watching from the rear with the Hungarian reserves, saw the trap unfold with horror. He had warned them, begged them to hold back. Now, the finest knights of Christendom were being crushed before his eyes. He tried to advance with his troops, but the battlefield was already lost. Ottoman cavalry swept around in waves, cutting off any chance of rescue. Sigismund could only retreat toward the Danube, carrying with him the bitter knowledge that arrogance had doomed the crusade. On the Ottoman side, Sultan Bayezid surveyed the carnage with cold satisfaction. His strategy had worked flawlessly. He had lured Europe's might into a killing ground and broken them with discipline and cunning. With a gesture of his hand, the final wave surged forward. Janissaries advanced in relentless rhythm, spears stabbing halberds, chopping down those too exhausted to resist. The Crusaders' line shattered completely. Knights dismounted, fighting on foot, their fine armor now a prison as they were dragged down into the mud. One by one, the banners of Europe fell, Burgundy, France, and Germany swallowed in the dust. Trumpets, once blaring with pride, were silenced, drowned in the roar of Ottoman drums. In those final moments, the battlefield was no longer a contest of armies, but a slaughterhouse. Survivors fled toward the river, only to be cut down by Sipahi cavalry. The Danube itself turned red as men tried to swim to safety, arrows cutting them from behind. By the time the sun dipped low over Nicopolis, the dream of a new crusade lay broken, buried beneath heaps of corpses and the silence of defeat. When the sun set on the valley of Nicopolis, the crusader dream lay in ruins. Thousands of knights and soldiers littered the field, their bodies heaped among shattered stakes and broken banners. Those who had charged with songs of glory now lay silent, their armor stripped, their lives extinguished. The Danube itself bore witness to the slaughter, its waters choked with the dead of Europe. King Sigismund of Hungary, with only a fragment of his host, fled downriver to safety. He would survive, but the weight of failure would haunt him for the rest of his reign. John of Nevers and many other French nobles were captured, their youthful arrogance turned to chains. In the days that followed, Sultan Bayezid ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners. Only the highest-ranking nobles were spared for ransom. The fields around Nicopolis became a grave for Europe's pride. For Bayezid, the victory was absolute. He had shattered the strongest crusading army of the century and proved that Ottoman discipline and cunning could triumph over the reckless valor of Western chivalry. His name, the Thunderbolt, spread across Europe, spoken with fear and dread. The Balkans lay firmly under Ottoman shadow, and the path deeper into Central Europe seemed open. In the courts of Europe, the defeat was a shockwave. Burgundy mourned its dead sons, France raged at its humiliation, and the papacy's call for crusade was drowned in bitter silence. The myth of invincible chivalry had been broken on the stakes of Nicopolis. For decades, no great Western crusade would rise again. The defense of Christendom in the east would be left to Hungarians, Poles, and the small principalities of the frontier. Yet in the long arc of history, Nicopolis was not the final word. Though Bayezid triumphed, his empire would soon face its own catastrophe at the hands of Tamerlane. And though the crusading spirit faltered, Europe would in time recover, reorganize, and return to the struggle with new resolve. But in 1396, all that was distant. For those who marched to Nicopolis, the reality was simple, and brutal pride had been punished, and the flower of Christendom had withered in a single day. The Battle of Nicopolis was more than a defeat. It was a turning point. It marked the twilight of the medieval crusade and the dawn of a new age in which steel discipline and strategy would matter more than honor and arrogance. It was here on the banks of the Danube that the Middle Ages learned its harshest lesson.